So I'll begin just by introducing myself. My name is David Pickup. I'm the communications officer here at the CSLP. I've worn many hats over the years. I've worked here since 2009, and I was first hired as the systematic review librarian to assist the systematic review team, who are here with us today. Over the years, this team has contributed evidence on what works in educational technology and online education and helped to inform the early development of the Center's Learning Toolkit software. We've also worked with other members of the Center, as well as their graduate students, on various projects using review methodologies. Today, we'll hear from several members of the team, as well as other CSLP members who employ review methodologies in their research, about how they've used these methods and what they have learned using them. So we'll begin with Eugene Borkovsky, the review team's project manager, who is joined here today by two of the founding members of the team, Robert Bernard and Richard Schmidt. We'll also hear from Eric Dion from the Département d'Éducation et Formation Spécialisée at UQAM, who is using meta-analysis to investigate best practices in K-12 math education. And from Haida Hassan, Sébastien Plouillet-Alahi, and Win-Paul Varela from the Canadian Practitioners Network for the Prevention of Extremist Violence, who have conducted a series of reviews in the domain of violent extremism. We will then have some time at the end for questions and discussions, which hopefully will be lively. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Eugene, and just let me know when you want me to change the slides for you.
With your permission, I can either stand or sit, whatever makes you more comfortable.
We don't see you. So how will see you?
Once you start talking, it should settle on.
Welcome, everybody. You also read the announcement, so it's indeed this event about systematic reviews. All presenters are listed here because all of us hope to contribute to your better understanding of how systematic reviews help us make sense out of noisy data in different research fields, regardless whether it's qualitative research or quantitative research. The same. We can skip this slide because it basically repeats what they just told you, but very briefly, it will start with the introduction to methodology, and it will be really brief. It's only intended to help you to better understand the upcoming presentation of individual projects. Then Eric, Haida's team, and will take turn again to talk about comparative effectiveness of distance education, classroom instruction, online learning, and blended learning. And we hesitated whether to allow questions for each presentation, but eventually decided to ask you to keep all questions towards the end after all presentations are done. Though it may be not fresh in memory, but it will allow us to flow smoothly. And as David said, he's here. He's not just the CSLP librarian or informational specialist. He is an indispensable contributor to all projects you're about to hear about, and he kindly agreed to be our timekeeper. So let's start. Usually when initiating discussion about why systematic reviews are important and why I personally so fond of them, I give my students a few personal examples from early days of my life in academia. And today I also decided to give a personal example, but much closer to home, so to speak. A couple of years ago, during one of the regular CSLP retreats, we took part in this fashionable team building exercise. We were given a set of postal cards and asked to pick up the most attractive person and most attractive one and explain why this picture reflects our interest in research, why we're engaged in research activities. To my big surprise, the pronounced consensus was, and I quote, "We're here to make the world a better place." I sounded my concern then, and I'm about to do it again here. First, in my view, it's a little bit arrogant. It's like people in other professional fields are driven by completely different, maybe even opposing motivation. But most importantly, it explains nothing. Ask people from different political parties, from different religions, they all agree the world should be a better place to live in. They just disagree what better is and how to get there. So in my view, and I hope the audience at least partly will share my opinion on this, our major responsibilities as researchers is to contribute to better understanding what improvements are needed and how to implement them more effectively. With this in mind, I have to tell you that the main problem in this is the amount of information. You can switch to the next slide. Amount of information we have to deal with. We all are well aware of this, but usually it's not explicitly expressed in numbers. So please forgive me the simplicity of the next slide. There are three hot topics or controversial topics on which people may disagree. And imagine yourself to be a novice in the field who wants to gain some information, scientifically based information. So you go to Google Scholar, not regular Google free search. And these are the numbers you will see in response. Of course, these numbers are not unique. Articles repeated many, many times on different websites, but still. For example, distance education is highlighted here because it's one of the ongoing presentations, upcoming presentations, sorry. Still, 5 million potential hits versus 688 effect sizes, which we in our early meta-analysis summarized in one average point estimate for each outcome type. One for achievement, one for attitudes, one for attrition. And in my view, it is why we need systematic reviews. And in comparison with both primary research and other forms of reviews, for example, narrative reviews, systematic reviews allow us to optimize and summarize research for informing and enabling evidence-based practice, literally making sense out of noisy data, provide better estimates of population parameters, of course, because they are based on much larger samples. They enable high transparency, offer means of bias detection and reduction, and the ability to assess multiple outcomes in multiple domains under different conditions. In other words, we always take into account the context in which research is done and practice unfolds. David?
Yeah, I'm clicking. Yeah, there we
Systematically explore and explain variability. That's important. We'll talk about it. And finally, but no less importantly, address methodological quality of included studies and identify gaps in existing research. Of course, they are not without problems and limitations, but those are largely associated with advantages. For example, if you allow many studies that contain errors, these errors tend to accumulate, putting in jeopardy the reliability of the findings. A little bit of history. These two people on the slide are because they are closely associated with the systematic reviews. The term meta-analysis was first introduced in 1976 by Jim Glass, but the real first meta-analysis was conducted much earlier in 1904 by Charles Pearson. You may be familiar with the name, coefficient of correlation of the same name. So in 1904, Pearson conducted a research summarizing data coming from 6 different settings, hospitals and military installations across Great Britain on the effectiveness of vaccination against typhoid. And here is the reprint of the original paper. He used the effect size, which is now known as odds ratio or risk ratio, and this interpretation is very simple. It reflects the proportion of people who contracted the disease being vaccinated versus those who were in the control group not being vaccinated. And then the next step, those fallen ill who survived out of the first group and who survived out of the second group. So what were the findings? Pearson commented on the lowness of the effect size. In other words, practical applied value. The vaccine he tried to understand the effectiveness of was not good enough. Better is needed. Speaking of relevance to recent events. He also pointed out the extreme irregularity. Different sites produce different results. They were not identical. And it's what we call heterogeneity and what we like to explore. And finally, also, he commented on how data were obtained. Specifically, self-selection versus randomization of participants might have introduced bias, putting again in jeopardy the reliability of findings. We can even take key messages from 1904. First of all, keep in mind applied value, what works. Also, consider and try to explain variability, when it works, where it works, for whom it works better. And finally, it helps us guide in further research by selecting good quality studies, potentially answering the question why we're observing what we're observing.
All right, can you guys hear us? Sorry about that.
Yes.
Yeah, we have you back, David.
Yeah, sorry, we had a power failure, but 1 second, I'm just going to relaunch the.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience and apologies for the interruption. So we were here, still a little bit of history. So in 1976, Jim Glass at the ARA annual meeting presented the outcomes of meta-analysis on the effectiveness of psychotherapy. It was an attempt to revisit and update the conclusion reached by another big name researcher, Henry Eisen, who said that psychotherapy does not have any effect on patients.
Right.
So we're still working on the slides. Yeah.
Okay.
So one more. Mary Smith and Jim Glass 1 year later published this study, and I would like to ask to pay your attention to 3 points. One is striking difference striking difference in conclusions. Psychotherapy doesn't work, psychotherapy works. The second point is the number of cases on which the conclusion was based. 6 in Eisen's review and 375 studies with 833 effect sizes summarized in Smith and Glass review. And finally, it may be helpful for you, may be helpful in understanding the interpretation of the effect size. In this case, effect size of 0.68 means that on average, the typical therapy client is better off than 75% of untreated individuals. As I said before, during the time we were interrupted, it generated a very heated discussion between Eisen and other opponents of the new methodology and proponents of meta-analysis. We unfortunately don't have time to discuss it in more detail. It lasted decades until in 1993, Lipson stated Smith and Glass meta-analysis. It's very interesting for psychology students usually. Oh yes, it works. Okay. It does. I don't know if any of us here is busy plan. Hopefully not, but if you are about to, remember, you may be unlucky and meet poor psychotherapists, but in general, it works. So fast forward, not only by now, this methodology is well accepted, but there are international organizations, dedicated entirely to maintaining developing further and promoting, especially for novice researchers, the methodology of systematic reviews. It's Campbell collaboration in social sciences, what works clearinghouse in education, Cochrane collaboration in health-related research, and also since 2008, American Psychological Association publishes guidelines for conducting and reporting standards in research in general and systematic reviews in particular. A few examples of definitions. According to Littell, systematic review aims to comprehensively locate and synthesize research that bears on a particular big, meaning of large interest to large population, applied value question, using organized, transparent, and replicable, in other words, systematic procedures at each step of the process. Another definition is given by the classic in the field, Harry Cooper. Research synthesis focus on empirical studies and seek to summarize past research by drawing overall conclusion. In case of quantitative research, it's an average estimate of the effect size from many separate investigations that address related or identical hypotheses. Once again, big question and much more power to the research that addresses it. Same Cooper outlined 7 steps in conducting systematic reviews, regardless whether they're qualitative or quantitative. We don't have time to pay attention to each one of them. Will suffice to say that if it generates enough interest, we are prepared to organize another event in which we will talk specifically about methodological issues, hands-on exercises, etc. But for now, I just wanted to point your attention on 3 components. First, it's search literature. An example of it on the next slide. It's one of the search strategies we used in our meta-analysis. David here can give you not just an overview, but a semester-long course of how to create systematic reviews. It's exactly what he does at Concordia, teaches undergrads. The more important thing is that we need to account for as many synonyms as possible, combining them with Boolean operators or and, to account for all possible definitions of interventions, outcomes, populations in questions, settings in questions, and other conditions. And our searches should be as exhaustive and representative as possible. But it doesn't mean that we are using all we find, because on step 4, and I'm jumping over step 3, we'll understand why, because we also evaluate the quality of studies before admitting them to any systematic reviews. We have a framework for that proposed by one of Cooper's students, Jeff Valentine, and it includes checking to what extent each study under consideration fits the demands of high quality or avoiding threats of 4 types of validity. We check whether operations used in the admitted or considered study reflect concepts and phenomena we are interested in. We also check for clarity of causal inference. In quantitative research, it's called internal validity. We also pay attention to generalizability of findings. To what extent they represent the practical field. It's why occasionally we allow not only high quality experiments, but also high quality field studies. And finally, we need to make sure that our analytical tools, whether again qualitative or quantitative, are good enough and our conclusions are statistically or qualitatively based, grounded. And then we gather information from the studies, admitted studies. Why I put it here? Because it shows the difference between qualitative and quantitative systematic reviews. Both quantitative and qualitative meta-synthesis, they allow us to summarize data, but they do it in different ways. They are different in nature and source of data from primary research, and in analytical tools with help of which we extract and aggregate data. Qualitative research usually takes data from interviews, focus groups, ethnographic research, content analysis, case studies, etc. It's more flexible, but it has its own tools to make sure the quality of outcomes or the consistency of outcomes is achieved through different means of triangulation, emergent themes analysis, etc. But more importantly, qualitative research is not only about what people think, but also why they think or behave in a particular way. In our view, they are not in opposition to each other. They are best used to guide each other. For example, our selection of moderator variable for analysis in meta-analysis very often are based on good quality qualitative research that points out the study characteristics that are important in explaining further variability in extract effect sizes. But I will allow Heide's team to speak more about qualitative research. I will focus more on quantitative part. So the purpose of meta-analysis, which is quantitative synthesis, is to estimate effect size, estimate variability that surrounds effect size, and explain as much as possible this variability based on coded moderator variables or study features. Next slide. Don't be confused, it's not a virus. Though quite recently, Eric shared with me his experience. He saw a person in a t-shirt with a similar picture. And the phrase, which is modified from Nietzsche, what does not kill you, mutates and tries again.
Oh, this is so good.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Perfect, thank you, Eric.
This.
But this picture here, just to illustrate the difference between primary research logic on the left side and meta-analysis on the right side. We conduct primary research, no, not yet. We conduct primary research mostly on analysis of significance of findings and either reject the null hypothesis or retain null hypothesis. In other words, we interpret studies individually, and the only way to summarize it is through narrative review. On contrary, meta-analysis allows extraction of individual effect size regardless whether the finding is statistically significant or not, and aggregated into an average point estimate, which is possible because it is a standardized measure. It's the difference between experimental and control group divided by pool standard deviation, which allows us to aggregate effects or findings from studies that use different metric, different scale in the outcomes they measure. It could be positive, which means treatment group outperform control. It could be negative, which means control outperform treatment. And that's a very important observation because coming back to our hope to improve the world. Of course, all innovations are introduced to do exactly that, but not necessarily what we hope for works in real life. It's why any innovation in education specifically needs to be tested. And that's exactly what we are doing. Next one, please. Here, just a few illustrations of the magnitude of the effect. Here, it's not one sample normally distributed. Just think about it as two distributions which are identical to one another with zero effect size, no difference in mean. The next one shows you 0.4, which is the upper boundary of so-called low effect sizes. And the next one, 0.85, it's an upper boundary of moderate effect sizes. And they show you the shift from one distribution control group to another when the factor of treatment is introduced. How else to interpret that? You can use qualitative scale offered by Cohen from small through medium to large. But also remember what we were talking about after looking at Glass and Smith meta-analysis. One click, one standard deviation or effect size of +1 means that average person, the last line, average person in the treatment condition does better 84% than average person in the untreated or treated business as usual condition. In social sciences, most of the effects are clustered around 0.3, 0.4. This is rather small to moderate effects. But my last point in interpreting it is that knowing the magnitude of the effect, it's not all we need to make practical decisions. Because let's say effect size of 0.2 is relatively small, but if to achieve it, you need just to introduce new textbook, which was already published, cost almost nothing. While simulations, especially in STEM disciplines, may produce effect size even above 1 standard deviation. But to introduce computer simulations, virtual reality in every classroom cost much more. Back to our beginning and back to 2 weeks ago presentation on whether randomized controlled trials present sufficient data. They may, and effect size summarized data allow us to present randomized controlled trials even better, but it's not all. Policymakers need to take into account, but also take into account the means, the resources available to either introduce changes or keep business as usual. Here, just suggested reading, if you want to get deeper into this, or if you're interested, we can schedule or design another meeting to talk about it in more details. So with this, I give the floor to Eric. Switch. Sure.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Eric Dion from Université du Québec à Montréal. I feel obligated to say that I'm funnier in French, but I'll do my best in English today. I haven't rehearsed my talk, so we'll see what comes up. Slides eventually.
Yeah, I'm sharing the screen again.
You can speak in French if anybody.
No, it's okay. Or I could answer questions in French. So we did a meta-analysis on effective math instruction, and it's kind of a big thing in Quebec because it's not usual to do such things. Where in most researchers in math are closer to a French tradition of research, which is kind of very qualitative in its orientation. So we figured that there was a lot of quantitative study on math instruction. Some of them are quite recent and very good, and we thought it was worthwhile to inform teachers about those studies. So there you go. So we set out to do another meta-analysis. It's not the first on math instruction. There are at least, I can think of at least 6 or 7 that have been published over the years since the 80s, since Slavin in 84 or something like that. But we set out to do another one, and as we should, we tried to do it better than the people who came before us, as opposed to worse, right? Always try to improve, but we had a specific goal in mind to try to do something that would generate not only reliable findings, because you know this is serious. Like, it's supposed to mean something. We're gonna talk to teachers and tell them, well, maybe it's better if you try a bit more of this and that. So we need to be serious about the kind of recommendation we make. So we want to be reliable, but we want to present reliable findings, but we also want to present usable findings, right? And I think that we're frequently kind of naive about the kind of findings that teachers are able to use given the time pressure that they face and stuff like that. So what we did, and we thought we had invented this at the time, but it's not so clear. We said, okay, let's do it this way. We're gonna involve practitioners from the very beginning of the meta-analysis to discuss with us how we should run this thing, what should be our criteria, and how we should code the studies and such. So we did what is termed apparently, not yet,
Okay, sorry.
a co-design meta-analysis that we did with practitioners from 4 Montreal school boards that were involved from the start. And we specifically involved directors of pedagogical services and pedagogical advisors. So the people who give advice to teachers on how they could or should teach. And of course, it would be better to have teachers with us in the team, but it's very difficult. You probably heard that it's very hard to liberate teachers because we're facing a shortage of teachers. So we went with essentially the people who work with them. So that's what we did. David. Okay, and we decided to select studies that were either experimental, that is randomized, and usually they are considered the better studies with good reason from a methodological standpoint, or I would say against my better judgment, quasi-experimental studies that we can have a long conversation about this, but quasi-experimental studies that are a bit more slippery when it comes to the rigor, but we decided to include them only the high-quality one that have pre-test and in which we make a demonstration that students who got the new things were at the beginning similar to the one who did not get it and stuff like that. Those were studies conducted in regular classrooms as opposed to special ed classrooms from grade 1 to 6, so really elementary school. And we're working now on the secondary level meta-analysis, but it's not today about this one. And in each study, researchers compare a new practice that I call here researcher introduced practice, the new thing, for instance, cooperative learning in some study, that was compared with unmodified business as usual instruction. So you would have essentially 2 groups of class, one that keep on doing what they were doing, and one that tried a new thing. And at the end, we assess math learning specifically. And just go back to, and a researcher introduced practice was deemed effective when students got better score on average with the new thing than with the old thing, the usual thing, say. And this is used to, as Eugene said, to compute an effect size, right? So, David. We excluded studies. I told you we wanted to be rigorous. We excluded studies in which fidelity of implementation was not assessed. And let's talk about this a bit later, but this is a very important part of our work. And we also excluded studies in which there was only one teacher per condition. So let's imagine you want to compare the usual with the new thing, and you have one teacher that tries the new thing with her group, and we compare the scores in this class to score in another class, and we conclude that, well, teacher who used the new thing, our students achieve better score, right? The problem with this kind of study is that you confound the teacher, the group, and the practice. So we decided to exclude those, and that meant excluding a lot of studies because the literature is either populated or polluted, depending on your view, with all kind of pilot study that are done quickly. And I call this the kind of, studies that we publish to have one more line in our CVs, right? But we all know that it's not so good, but still it's out there. So there are lots and lots and lots of this kind of studies. So we read more than 4,000 abstracts, and everything was done by 2 separate persons to make sure we had an inter-rater agreement. So more than 4,000 abstract, we read more than 1,000 full report to end up with 80 studies. So we set the net very, very broadly to end up with a very, very few studies. In part because our criteria are quite stringent. We only wanted to keep the solid, really, really good stuff, hopefully. but we'll see how we manage with this. So overall, when we computed all FXIs, we had a 0.41, which indicate the moderate effectiveness for the practice that we tested, but obviously, or of course, there's a lot of variation. So we have practice that had negative effect and practice that had huge effect and a lot of stuff in between. And as Eugene explained, our goal is to figure out what works and what doesn't work so well. So, David. First, our most obvious finding is that design matters a lot, right? Because when you compare the effect size for experimental studies, it's 0.35 as opposed to 0.80 for quasi-experimental studies. So it's more than, simple to double. So if we base our conclusion only on quasi-experimental studies, the less perhaps reliable studies, practice looks much more effective than with the more solid experimental study. And it's important to consider the design because design is also associated with difference in sample size. Experimental studies are a much larger sample size on average, more than 900 students as opposed to 300 for quasi-experimental studies. So, when we saw this, first thing we realized that we needed to be quite careful so as to avoid introducing bias or distortion in our findings. So we went looking for publication biases. And so that's a big thing in meta-analysis because we suspect that everything that's kind of out there is not necessarily everything that there is, right? There may be researchers who got findings that they did not find kind of trendy enough or positive enough and decided not to publish them. So there's a big branch of meta-analysis that try to figure out whether what is accessible represent all that has been done. And if the field, many fields are moving rapidly to make it more easier to make that kind of assessment. But for now, we just have what we can get. And we try to figure out whether or not this represents the whole picture versus only its rosy side, right? So we look for publication biases, and it's worth reading this nice definition from the internet. So publication biases is the selective publication of research studies based on their results, with positive findings being more likely to be published than studies with negative findings. So as shocking as it may seem, we do this collectively, and apparently if we, and I'm thinking about the work of this guy from Tufts University, Yakun, I think. He says that not only it exists, but it's apparently endemic. It's kind of difficult to figure, right? Because we only see what's there. We don't see what should be there, but it's not. But if we look at our finding, what we did here is that we make a distinction based on sample size. We made the distinction between studies with small sample size, intermediate sample size, and large sample size. And we treated it as a categorical variable because the difference are so huge that it would not be possible to represent those differences graphically if treated as a continuous variable, because essentially we have studies with 50 students as opposed to a study with 2,000 students or something like that. So it goes from quite small to huge. So hence the categorization. So we have small intermediary study and large study that are either experimental or quasi-experimental. And what we did is that we made a broad distinction between FXIs that were negative. So this is negative or zero. Okay, so this is very disappointing for researchers, right? You want to introduce something that should work, but it doesn't. So negative intermediary is everything in between, in the kind of the normal or expected range, being generous, from 0 to 1.20, and then you have the large effect size. I just want to attract your attention to two type of studies that kind of suggest that there may be some problem in reporting. If you look at small, I'm in the bottom left of the graph. If you look at small quasi-experimental studies, those studies seems to be published essentially only when they have very large effect size. And so, you know, this looks like opportunistic publishing, right? It's not expensive, they're cheap to conduct, can do it basically without funding. If the findings are good, everybody's going to be happy, so let's publish it. If they're bad, let's forget about it and move on, right? It looks like that, right? If you look at the other side of the graph, at the top right corner of the graph, you have the large experimental study. And here, what we have is that those are essentially the only kind of study mostly, or this is the kind of study where this is clearer. Those are studies that are published even when findings are disappointing. And it makes sense because if you get a lot of money to conduct an experimental study, you are most of the time obligated to even just publish a report, make it accessible, to announce that, you know, it didn't work as planned. So there seem to be publication biases operating even with our criteria. So what we're going to do, and we're doing the analysis currently, we're going to be very, very careful to do all kind of verification to make sure that everything that we say is robust. For instance, if it's observed with quasi-experimental studies, we will make sure that it's also observed with experimental studies and things like that. Okay, fidelity of implementation, what that is the degree to which an intervention, a practice or program, etc., is delivered as intended. This is again super important because let's imagine you have like an effect size of 0. And you did not show that the intervention was implemented with fidelity. This very effect can be explained by two very different things. Either your intervention or your practice is not practical, it's not usable, or it was used by a teacher and it has no effect. Two very different conclusions. Or a third conclusion, your study was not conducted correctly. You were not in class enough to help teacher or to remind teacher to implement the practice, etc., etc. So we absolutely need a convincing measure of fidelity of implementation. And by convincing, we mean either that the researchers were in class to observe, or in case of technology, we had convincing information on the fact that students use, for instance, the app correctly. We discard studies in which researcher asked teachers, well, did you do as we agreed? And teachers said, well, yes. They're really nice, right? They're gonna say yes anyway. And it seems that fidelity of implementation was measured in all studies, right? So, and this is based on one of Fred's ideas that is with us in the audience. We went kind of further by saying that, okay, it was measured. Now, was it there? Right? So we made a distinction using liberal criteria between studies in which fidelity of implementation was not only measured, but demonstrated. This is yes. Other study when it was measured, but you know, researchers conclude that, okay, for instance, because there were too many schools on too large of a territory, we were not able to maintain fidelity of implementation, etc. And a bunch of other study in which it was unclear. And this is kind of surprising and a bit disturbing because a lot of researchers will tell you that, yeah, we measured fidelity of implementation because it's important, right? And they will go on for 1 or 2 sentences, and then they forget about it. They never report on whether there was fidelity or not, and this is in more than 1/3 of studies. It's kind of unsettling. David?
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of general characteristic of intervention, we coded for a lot of characteristics, but let me just go through a few. Numeric technology, or whether or not the new intervention relied on computers and things like that. So what we can see here is that the one without achieved significantly larger effect than the one that used technology. And yeah, this is gonna be the kind of the art of framing the message correctly, because this may sound like, okay, don't use computer in your class, obviously it doesn't work. But it's not my reading of the studies we have. My reading is more that the technology people are not very good at conducting studies in the messy world of classroom. They seem to assume in general that you install an app and students are gonna use it and they're gonna learn things. It's more complicated than that, right? And I think they're improving on the way they're conducting study, but they're not there yet. So in my opinion, the jury is still out. In terms of math learning, with regard to the effectiveness of technology, know that it's still effective because the with technology 0.31 is significant. But it's also significantly lower than without. In terms of pedagogical approach, we made the broad distinction between guided discovery and direct instruction. And if you never heard about those two types of pedagogical approaches, because you're not in education, because it's a big thing now, right? A lot of people have been pushing for guided discovery for a long time. It's kind of the preferred academic way of teaching stuff. And then you have the kind of newcomer, I would say, direct instruction that seems to be getting good results. It seems to work, right? And a bunch of meta-analysis. So we made the distinction between those two approaches. And what you can see here is that direct instruction is slightly more effective than guided discovery, but guided discovery is also effective compared to control instruction. So this is going to be very interesting, because a lot of people assume that if you're doing a meta-analysis or talking about evidence-based practice, it means that you're automatically for direct instruction, automatically and exclusively for direct instruction. And I can tell you that we're going to use this finding to say we're not for or against any type of instruction. We're for what works, and that's it. And I'm very glad that we're getting this kind of finding, which is, by the way, robust in terms of design and in terms of measure. The only thing, and maybe we can get back to it later, is that guided discovery was essentially not tested with low-income students. Right, so we may have kind of a democratic problem here, because it seems that it worked well with, more favored student, but we don't know about low-income ones. So we're gonna have to figure out at some point what we do with this. That's an interesting one. As I told you, we coded for a lot of features of the intervention, and this was like essentially an afterthought, right? Okay, let's see if they prescribe homework as part of the intervention. And surprise, surprise, it made a huge difference at 0.76 versus 0.36. And based on this, right, we could go to the media and say, yeah, well, we've showed that more homework is better, so let's go teacher even more homework. And those of you who have like school-age kids, you probably realize that this means more nightly torture. Of course, it's not that simple, because this is essentially a correlational finding, right? Because homework is one characteristic among others in intervention, and the presence or absence of homework was not just distributed randomly over the intervention. So we need to be super careful. And what I did this morning is that I went back to all studies that use homework and did qualitative analysis to see what were those studies. And essentially, the very large effect size comes from the infused study. in which you use homework to encourage students to generalize notions that were learned in the class. And in general, this intervention this is close to the sublime. It's superbly done from beginning to end, and the use of homework is just one part of this, right? So we need to be careful with we kind of frame those findings for teachers. We were guided by 3 general questions, and that's those questions that we agree with the practitioners that are on the team with us. So effective for what? Effective for whom? And more effective than what? Right? David? So what do we mean by effective for what? We mean that to teach what, which notion, and to encourage what kind of learning. And we were and this may sound like a very obvious idea, but this was not like explored that much in previous meta-analysis on math instruction. We started from this idea that maybe to teach arithmetics, plus, minus, and stuff, really basic stuff in math, we need an approach that's different from geometry, right? It may depend on the notion, and this is a big thing for teachers too, right? Maybe, this could work with like first grader, like teach them arithmetics, maybe not so sixth grade for pre-algebra and stuff like that, We tend to think of math, okay, math is math, and there's maybe just one way to teach math, but we were told by practitioners not to do that and make distinction about the kind of notion that we're instructing, which we did. And so what we did, we made detailed coding of which math notion were instructed in the intervention or the practice introduced by researchers, and what math notions were assessed. And this allowed us one key thing, I think, is to determine the degree of alignment between instruction and assessment. But this also opened a Pandora box because almost every or a lot of practice address more than one notion. And some assessments assess more than one type of notion. So we ended up with this kind of mixture, right? If you look at it, this was a very difficult graph to produce. And this is why it's not translated entirely in English, because I could not do it. It's super complicated. But if you just look at the, on top, the practice that address arithmetics, you can see that in some study, arithmetic was assessed, but usually, or it was not the only thing that was assessed, because for some study, that's the kind of bluish band that goes to the rectangle kind of in the middle. Learning was assessed with a general measure that address a lot of different notions. So we have this mixture, and this is going to be, we're going to think on how we can present this kind of interesting mess of studies and findings to make it like to transform this into a clear message if we can for teachers. And it's going to be a challenge and an interesting one. Okay, so I was talking about the degree of alignment between assessment and researcher introduced practice. So one of the things we noticed almost immediately when we started doing analysis, is that you get a much stronger effect size if you use an assessment that's only about one notion that was instructed, right? 0.63, as opposed to when you use an assessment that covers multiple notions, some that were not instructed, you get 0.13, which is significantly different from 0, which means that you get a bit more than you teach, but not that much, right? And incidentally, and this is going to be interesting, a lot of people will say that, okay, that's a direct instruction finding, right? You teach something, children learn it, but they learn this and only that, and they cannot do anything with it. But the interesting thing is that we get exactly the same findings with guided discovery. Is the same. You essentially get what you teach plus a bit more, not that much. Effective for room, we were supported in part by one of my very dear colleagues, Isabelle Plante, who's into gender differences. And she was really interested to see whether some instructional methods were more effective for girls than boys. And well, we observed that most classes are made up of 50% girls. That's not a terrible surprise here. And in essentially all studies that we considered, findings were combined for girls and boys. So we will not be able to speak to this kind of difference. 20% of our studies were conducted in low income neighborhood. So we're gonna have enough study to make a difference between, to be able to say tentatively whether something that works in higher income neighborhood also work in lower income neighborhood. That's very important, including, of course, for our partners who work in Montreal and where low income neighborhoods are kind of common. Thank you. I mentioned this earlier, guided discovery was basically not studied in low income neighborhood. So point that out too. Some study made the difference between students based on their pre-test scores on the math measure. And if you look at the bottom, we've got some quite interesting findings. For instance, effect size of 0.67 for high achievers and 0.46 for learning disabled students. And you can see that in studies in which the researcher made a difference between students based on pretest score, they got quite high effect size, right? The trick here is that when you look at the other study that did not make this kind of distinction, you get a lower effect size of 0.34. So you would expect findings for all students being to be the average of those effect size, but that's not what we're seeing. So probably that means that the researcher who look at moderation in this way we're not working with the same population or with the same kind of intervention, etc. So we will have to look very carefully into this. And this was our selling point for SHRP. We told them we're not the first, but what we're going to do differently is that we're going to take into account what was done in the control condition as best as we can. And this is super important in a school context because you never or very rarely compare a new intervention to nothing, right? Students always get some form of instruction, right? But there's no placebo in school. And we need to know what we compare the new thing with, right? Because effect size are by definition measure of comparative effectiveness. And it's worth reading the definition of comparative, meaning perceptible by comparison, relative, right? So if you we deem a practice to be effective when it's more effective than regular instruction, but there are findings coming out that tells us that if regular instruction change and become better or more effective, a same researcher introduced practice will become less and less effective with time. So we need to characterize in one way or the other the business as usual instruction. And one very strong impression you get from reading all those studies is that researchers are very interested in talking and describing their intervention, it's their thing, it's their baby, they like it, they work on it for many years and they're very excited about it. You know, with comparison to what happened in regular class, you get this impression that researchers are kind of assuming that teachers are always doing the same kind of mediocre stuff year after year, right? It's the usual not too good and homogeneous stuff, right? It's not even worth talking about it. So you add this in the older study, it's changing, right? Because if you look at recent studies, and I mean published after 2010, you usually have very detailed description of the business as usual instruction, which you don't have in older study. There you go. So it's essential to qualify the unmodified business as usual instruction, if only to answer the very basic teacher question, does it look, okay, this supposedly effective thing, does it look like what I'm doing right now? Because if so, means I'm on the good road, right? If not, I need to change, but I need to know if it's similar or different to what I'm doing, right? So we need this information. As I said, detailed information is available in recent study. No, I forgot one of the slide. So far, we have only been able to ascertain whether or not the same notion were addressed in the researcher introduced practice as in the business as usual instruction for a similar amount of time. But kind of disappointingly, this variable does not seem to explain a lot in FXIs, but we're still trying. And maybe our problem is because of the poverty of information in many studies on the business as usual instruction. So that's where we are. And we're gonna spend at least the next 2 months kind of analyzing those data with the practitioners. So that's why.
Good. You need a one.
Yeah.
Second.
I like to be up. That's my thing. Don't need to. So thanks for both for having put the work to do that great looking PowerPoint. Thanks. I'm not actually sure which slide and content each of us is going to present, so we're going to freestyle it. So on that, maybe Haida can present who we are as a team.
No, we're gonna go very quickly, so we're just says it, evidence-based and practitioner-centered network that really focuses on translating best evidence into potentially usable and useful practices. So yeah, why we do the systematic review, that's the reason, and we often, when we can, the systematic review is always our first step to a Delphi process, because in the field of preventing violent extremism, there is no best evidence. So we need to develop consensus-based guidelines, basically.
Right.
That's pretty much what we.
And kind of feel very intimidated by Eric's work because it's really rigorous. You know, it analyzes all of the different permutations that could explain the results in a meta-analytic way with motivators and stuff. But in the PVE space, I would say that like 90% of the research is qualitative, so we cannot take that approach as is, and we have to delve into more of what we call narrative synthesis, which is, well, you assess the study with the same criteria in terms of how solid they are, what's their topic, and you aggregate outcomes, but you do not think about the results in terms of effect size, but in terms of what's the kind of key message that emerges from these studies that we review. So we have done many systematic reviews and ongoing Delphi processes on different topics related to the prevention of violent extremism. We have done one on online radicalization, one on the effectiveness of primary and secondary PVE programs and practices, one on tertiary PVE programs. So these are kind of resistance programs or de-radicalization programs, even though the term is not really liked by the field. We're gonna go in there later. We've just finished one on risk assessment tools, the psychometric properties of a risk assessment tool for violent extremism, with pretty dire conclusions. We have also finished one on trajectories that lead people to go towards the violent extremism, and we are starting one on trajectories out of violent extremism, which is probably going to have a bunch of like a major overlap with the ones on tertiary PVE programs, because these are the same space. And we have other ones on government-led CVE campaigns, which is held by Winpol. So go ahead.
Yeah, so while preparing this, I thought it'd be interesting just for us to have a look at the reasons why we need a team. As you can see, actually, we get through quite a lot of articles, thanks to David.
Sorry.
And also not just thanks to David, but also to that, you know, when we look at what kind of variables and what kind of what we're looking at for specific reviews, we would had up to, in one case, almost 20,000 hits, and up to 14 co-authors. So it really does take a team. So it's the information retrieval specialist, it's the experts, it's the people who code, it's the people who produce the summary pamphlets, translate, edit, do the podcasts. It really is a big team of people involved. Also, the reviews begin with a logic model to give an idea of what kind of variables are involved, and some of the intermediate outcomes and the final outcomes. This one is actually the model that was used for the review on tertiary prevention programs. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to say about that.
No, I think, I mean, it's really very important. Sometimes we use the PICO, sometimes we just don't refer to PICO questions, but logic model, because it guides everything, guides every single step of our research, and it kind of orients as well the eligibility criteria for the different research that we need to include. But I mean, these are things you know very well already.
And these kinds of logic model are especially relevant when you're working with heterogeneous studies, which is massively the case because it's mostly qualitative studies. So even defining what constitutes primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, not always clear. Sometimes we have had studies which define themselves as primary prevention, and we said, shoot, no, it's secondary prevention, actually, according to our definition of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. So that can change. And also the difference between intermediate and final outcomes is of major importance. So which is intermediate outcomes is things that are purposed to be associated with violent extremism behaviors. I don't know, like identity stability, I don't know, social integration, potential mental health problems or improvement on one's mental health condition, self-esteem, whatever. And some programs look at whether they are able to improve these psychosocial characteristics, but then there's the slight missing link, which is, does this improvement also lead to a decrease in violent radical attitudes and behaviors? And we don't always have that. So we kind of have a truncated picture of the phenomenon, and the link between risk factors and protective factors and actually violent extremists acting out is, well, as in all other fields of violence, there's a link, but it's not a cause and effect link always.
But it's in our field, it's very important to differentiate this, because in the early conversations on prevention programs for violent extremism, for example, there were a lot of people who would say there is no need to fund primary prevention programs because they don't stop somebody from committing a violent act. So why would we do that? But it was exactly based on the confusion of what is the purpose of a primary prevention program. The primary secondary prevention program does not aim at stopping somebody from doing violence tomorrow. They aim at reducing the vulnerability factors. So distinguishing these were essential even for policymakers and program funders to understand what they are exactly funding and what they should expect as outcomes. So these were other reasons for our field that are important, and to distinguish, you may succeed in improving empathy, great,
Mhm.
but you shouldn't think that then that person is not going to do it.
And one of the funny results
Yeah.
that we have on that is that there's a lot of intervention done to improve the employability of persons. And what the results tell us is that once you help somebody get a job, the radical attitudes don't change at all. Sometimes they go up a little higher, but the violent extremist acting out goes down. So the person remains with their ideological convictions, but actually does not go to kill somebody. So even if it doesn't affect the attitudes, it affects the behavior. So kind of success, achieved. Go ahead.
Okay, so yes, as you said at the start, so one of the main aims, of course, is the yellow box, so the evidence and consensus-based practice guidelines. So we start with a systematic review, and then if there's a lot of money, we have a consensus conference and we get like experts to come in and look at our results. And then there's a thing called the Delphi processes, which I'm sure everybody here knows all about, but it's basically where people evaluate the findings from the consensus conference, and then we come up with like a nice, hopefully like mutually agreed upon set of guidelines.
So this is kind of the CP and PrEP recipe, which is we start with systematic review, we have conclusions from that review, and then we produce initial recommendations for practice, and not only research. The conclusion that every systematic review is more, better, and research is needed, and yeah, of course. But we like to, get our hands dirty and look for recommendations also for practice. So then we produce these recommendations based on evidence, but maybe that, we're 5 years late on the ground practice. So there's always that possibility. So then we organize consensus conferences and Delphi processes, which are ways to submit our recommendations to practitioners and have them tell us if we're wrong or relatively right. And we've had both situations. Sometimes they're like, thanks for giving like a data-backed affirmation of what we're feeling in our practice for 5 to 10 years. And sometimes they're like, this is kind of outdated. Here's how you should reframe that recommendation.
I think the only challenge we face when we are facing when we're looking for consensus-based practice guidelines is the fact that by definition, consensus will erase the subtleties. Like people tend to have consensus on more general statements, which may be less relevant sometimes for practitioners because they lose the granular aspects. So we always have to kind of strike a balance between consensus, but also, having somebody read this and say, what have you taught me?
So yeah, so because we work in a field where like precise intervention dosage cannot be, determined by empirical evidence alone, and even the empirical evidence is of various quality, then we kind of have to do the next best thing, which is look at practitioner consensus, and that's how we kind of merge both empirical evidence and practitioner consensus. Yes.
So because of government, because of the fact that governments often invest a lot of money in programs, we need to know obviously if they're working or not, and some of them have been found not to work thanks to meta-analyses. So for example, if we look at the single-sex schooling, there's not actually any consistent evidence that single-sex, so separating the students leads to better performance once you take into account factors such as the socioeconomic variables involved. And then, yeah, you have other examples there, but I think we need to move on.
Yeah.
So in our field, that was important because when the PVE program started, some of the programs that were established in countries that had massive funding, so for example, Saudi Arabia or other programs, or the Tamil Tigers related evaluation program, were publicized as, panacea programs. And then even in Canada, the government started thinking about, establishing and funding such programs. Whereas our effort in systematic review was to check whether there is a myth to debunk. When we started looking for research that had actually proven the efficacy of these programs, we found none. So there was no research. The Saudi Arabian programs had talked about like a almost 99% success rate, which is. And then the Tamil Tiger, well, it succeeded because the group was dismantled. So, people stopped being part of an extremely violent
Very
group.
good preventive.
So-
Decided to-
Yes, it's a preventative measure, but, so the myth debunking in the field of intervention is really very important because a lot of programs can be publicized as being efficient and actually they're not.
So basically what the core of our presentation is to actually highlight these very interesting, sometimes quite surprising conclusions that doing these systematic reviews led to. So we're not going to focus on the methods. David and Regine did a very thorough presentations about the ins and outs of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. However, we're going to go to the more of the meat of the results. These are obtained from mostly narrative synthesis of qualitative studies. But still, here are a bunch of interesting findings that we did not necessarily expect to find, but still actually found. So maybe with primary and secondary PVE, Raida, you can go ahead. I'll go with the tertiary PVE.
Sure, and I think what was good about the fact, and I relate to what you're saying in thinking about practitioners and involving practitioners, is the fact that we would hear people say, and practitioners say, don't target specific groups, this stigmatizes communities, individuals, and actually in terms of evidence, this is exactly what we found, is that any program that is developed to target a specific identity group, so for example, programs that were specifically targeting Muslim communities or Muslim youth, produced much more negative effects than positive effects. One of the good things about the studies in the PVE field is that they do assess both positive and negative outcomes. Not all of them, but those that do assess the negative outcomes. And another issue, which is really important in a field that is still to today predominantly dominated by securitization approach. So detect, put in jail, and then don't think about the consequences when people go out or what they go through when they're in jail. Is the fact that actually security measures produce much more negative effects and can make the problem worse than psychosocial support and psychosocial interventions. And then in tertiary PVE, did you want to talk about it?
Yeah,
I think
it's
it's just
criminology,
yeah.
so it's my stuff.
Yeah, so that's
The main things that we found, and that was kind of surprising to us, was that de-radicalization or targeting the identity and cognitive element of extremism doesn't really work. What works is everything else. And there's kind of this dilemma to whether are extremist ideas the cause of actions or is it a symptom of other causes that namely leads to engagement in extremist ideas. And what seems to be the case, it's most often than not, extremist ideas are the symptom of, more bigger psychosocial vulnerabilities in terms of social connection, social isolation, let's say fragile mental health, and other stuff that leads the person to be disconnected from society and isolated. And when extremist groups try to recruit, the message is extremely seductive because it gives affiliation that the person did not have previously. It was exactly the trajectory that happened for the mosque shooting of Quebec. It was exactly somebody who was socially isolated in his high school, described as weird by his peers, and then kind of radicalized and joined the group that called for action, and he volunteered to do that.
So I think that one of the important things around these issues is we are lucky in circumstances when we have governments that kind of listen a little bit to researchers. Not all governments do that. But one of the examples of the importance and the reason why we conduct systematic reviews, although, you know, making the world a better place, I agree with you, is the fact, for example, in Canada, in the beginning, the violent extremism prevention strategy was almost a copy paste of the US violent extremism prevention strategy. It was highly securitized, it was highly detect. And it was even in the beginning kind of looking at the UK strategy, which the UK has for an example of asking teachers in schools to detect and being mandated to report to police students who they suspect may have violent extremism. And so the fact of studying these approaches that have produced iatrogenic effects have in part contributed to Canada shifting their prevention strategy and moving from a discourse that was highly securitized in 2000. Yeah, to, oh, this is a whole of society problem, and we have a multi-sectoral, and it was because of studies that have assessed the iatrogenic effects of interventions, and then systematic reviews that had documented that, well, yes, you know, don't ask teachers to detect students because this is not their job and it will only hurt and create more grievances. So it's just to show that we're not in that, you know, the research can have and systematic reviews can have important implications for policymakers and program funders. It's important.
And as Raida said, for the moment at least, we are lucky to have the ear of the government via the Community Resilience Fund. Not all countries and provinces are so lucky. So just to close the point on tertiary prevention, basically what we found, at least what practitioners found, so when practitioners were told to work on the cognitive elements of intervention, then they thought it's hard. Like, what legitimacy would me, like a Quebecer with no particular affiliation to any religion, would I have in doing religious education for radical Islamists? I would have none, and
neo-Nazi.
yeah, and no amount of hours of training is going to make me feel legitimate to conduct such type of intervention. So practitioners said, well, we really don't like doing it. If I intervene with an incel who consumes masculinist contents 10 hours per day, like I won't win the debate, even though I have a university PhD. I mean, it doesn't matter. I will lose that debate. So targeting the cognitive elements for practitioners, basically none felt that they were trained enough to do so. And then actually on clients, persons of interest, that they said that this kind of broke the therapeutic alliance and caused them to double down their ideology rather than, because it confronts their whole identity. And what actually worked both for clients and for practitioners is target everything else. Help the person find housing, help the person find employment, help give individual support, psychological support to the person. So basically work on education, whatever. So basically by doing everything else, like the root cause is basically the social disconnection is potentially remedied. And then even though some attitudes that are extreme may remain, violent behavior or violent intent will come down with that. So again, that was one of the big things. And the only stance where DRAP programs were effective is when there was messenger credibility. So for example, when ex-radicalized persons were put to use as practitioners to because they understand the reality of the persons they are helping. Anybody want to go? Do you want to go with the risk assessment?
Okay.
You worked on that one.
So we looked at one of the systematic reviews looked at the reliability and validity of the risk assessment tools. So, you know, to identify whether or not somebody's going to go on to commit an act of violent extremism. And the kind of shocking thing that we found was that because most of the studies have been trying to measure predictive ability, they used retrospective designs. That meant that they don't actually have predictive validity, which is an issue. But there were lots of other mixed findings. So there were things like we found that you probably remember more about this.
So the tools had some inviolable psychometric, like iterative reliability was good in research setting, not so good in clinical settings. So then again, in terms of convergent validity, pretty good convergent validity, like the tools all kind of measure the same thing.
Good constructive validity. There was good constructive validity, so they matched, aligned with what it was supposed to be measuring.
Yeah, kind of good content validity. People felt that the items were the ones that should have been targeted by tools. But yeah, so because all of the samples were convenient samples, so for example, instead of following a participant group that was released from prison or whatever, it was all public, open source terrorist database who have some individual that went to violence and some that did not, and then they're trying to kind of data mine and map to see if tools get higher score for those that before the tool was even invented actually went on to commit violence. So this is kind of they all call this post-predictive validity, which we're far from randomized control trial. Let's just say it like that.
Yeah, which I mean, really is an issue because it means that the risk assessment for violence in this field is an absolute mess.
Yeah.
And yet many programs and many institutions and many policing organizations use the risk assessment tools that were included in this systematic review. Of course, they don't predict based on a tool like they have many other measures. But still, I mean, these tools are being used, and yet, you know, we don't know what value they really have. So
yeah, so we have to think in terms of practice into how, for which goals we are using these tools. I mean, they can be helpful reminders of, you know, assess all of these risk factors, think about all of these protective factors. So they're a good checklist to frame one's mind. But I would be wary, like as a security organization, to assume that if you have a higher score on the, let's say, Vera 2R, then you're really at higher risk of acting out. That we don't really know.
So yeah, and I mean, jokingly, this might be a good de-narcissizing exercise, meaning that, you know, maybe the field should stop being so stubborn about thinking that it has an ability to actually predict who can commit a violent act at some point in time. So, you know.
Online harms, I think it's more
Yeah,
like that.
online harms,
sorry.
very long process. So yeah, we're not getting into the nitty-gritty of the methodological aspects, but the systematic reviews are out, so they can be, you know, checked easily for the methodologies. But online harms is actually maybe one of our most surprising systematic review in terms of results, because, you know, I'm sorry, I always repeat this, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams, right? That research is the process of expensively, painfully, and slowly discovering the surprisingly obvious. You know, we know that now, but in this context, we were very surprised because actually, and it's practically the only systematic reviews where we found experimental studies and not just quasi-experimental studies that were conducted. So that's very interesting because we were able to meta-analyze and have effect sizes, both in terms of experimental, so more causal effects, and of course the bidirectional correlational effects. And we actually found that exposure to hate online, and I really absolutely wasn't expecting this, but we did find that exposure to hate online can both increase negative stereotypes toward targeted groups. It can increase violent and hateful behavior online, but also offline. it increases symptoms of depression. It reduces social trust, so trust in the other. And it reduces, I think, satisfaction with life. So there was a bunch of
Yeah.
negative, very negative consequences. Which, for me was a surprise. I really was not expecting to have hate online, to be documented as being so harmful. Although there are, of course, limitations for this. I mean, it's a 65, 70 page, I think, systematic for this one. But it does speak to the fact that we have a social issue and we have many governments trying to legislate and some that have
Less so.
completely unlegislated lately. And so, yeah, I think it's one of the interesting systematic reviews that tells us the complexity of how evidence can speak or not to policy and governments.
And I think that the big myth debunking moment that was like, oh, really? Was like, we assumed that it was like a catalyst effect. You expose a regular person to hate, and the person is gonna be, whatever. And then you maybe expose somebody that is already vulnerable for other reasons, and then you can accelerate the violent reaction that is ongoing. So we expected to find that catalyst effect, which is, of course, for victims of the content and an active consumer, it can have an adverse effect. But we expect that, for the general population, nobody cares. But actually, being the systematic review suggests that being bombarded with increasingly hateful rhetoric can have adverse effects, even for non-concerned person and like the social fabric at large. That was the big myth debunking moment that we have for the systematic review.
Sorry, just to interrupt, we're over time. We advertised this ending at 4:30, it's 4:40, just to put you where we are, so we have one more presentation, but maybe we can just do a quick.
But I'd like to defer mine to some future time.
Yeah, perhaps,
For two reasons. One is that it doesn't expand much on Eugene's presentation. In fact, it covers much of the same territory as his description of meta-analysis, not synthesis. And it also, in the sense that it moves into a new form of meta-analysis, which is called a second order analysis. Which means that it takes meta-analyses and meta-analysis, meta-analyzes them. And the second thing was to describe to you what we have done in the area of distance education. We started studying distance education in about 2000, that's right, 2000, it just sounds so weird. And then we published a big piece in RER on a big meta-analysis that has 3,800, by the way, citations right now. But it's 25 years old, so. Anyway, we have expanded, as so is the field, into different forms of distance education, not just the old kind that used the telephone and the mail system to get things back and forth to universities and teachers and students and so forth. I mean, we do so much more now, and I was going to describe to you 3 of these approaches, actually the only 3. There's some variations on each one of them, but basically there are just 3. There's distance, there's online learning, there's blended learning, and then there is flipped classroom, which is a brand new form that's mostly in the literature of the health sciences. And if you looked at those 3 in terms of second order meta-analysis, you'd see that those are ordered just the way I said them in terms of their overall effect size. While it's true that adding computers did help, it didn't help that much, because the effect size, when you compare it to classroom instruction, is not that much greater, the average effect size. Not so true, blended learning. Blended learning added another element because people were bored stiff. Sitting at home in front of their computer and they liked going to the university. The only problem is that during the pandemic, there was no blended learning because there were no classrooms. And so that's blew that. And then the last flipped classroom, I'll save for the next time we talk about this. But I think that, it doesn't add very much, in terms of knowledge about distance education, except to give you an update on what we've done as well as what the field is moving towards in terms of
Right.
research. So I'll pass until next time. And if you want to look at my slides, you may.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't want to necessarily call this to an end, but I just wanted to let you know the time. But if you wanted to turn to questions, we do have some that looks like they're piled up in the chat a little bit. So we have from Adam, we have, hi everyone, thanks to the center for organizing this very important seminar. I would like the experts to shed more light on how I can use software and artificial intelligence tools to facilitate the process of conducting systematic review and meta-analysis in the field of educational research. Thanks, and God bless you immensely. I get asked this every time I mention that I work on meta-analyses to people, they ask me, oh, what about AI? And yeah, so I guess it's an ongoing debate. Is it? I don't think anyone of us are working with AI for our reviews yet. Eric, do you have?
We tried because we figured at some point that, a lot of the work in, reading report and meta-analysis is quite tedious and repetitive. So we wonder if ChatGPT could do the job for us to analyze, how many girls were in the sample and maybe more advanced stuff. But we ended up like teaching ChatGPT to do it and then checking the work of ChatGPT. So it just doubles the work because we cannot rely as of yet on AI to do the coding, right?
I think the way we have relied on AI is more, so for example, the way we rely on AI is to look up, instead of when we used to open thesauruses and look for keywords. So we would, for example, Seb is an expert in asking exactly the specific enough question for ChatGPT to be able to give us an interesting answer, which is mostly based on keywords. Like, okay, I'm conducting a systematic review on this. These are the words. Can you give me a list of equivalent keywords that can support then our bibliographic searches? And then we give them to David, and then David, you go through them, you check and gives us more, and we correct. So we've been using it mostly for this, but not for other.
Bottom line, you have to supplement artificial intelligence
With
natural
human, of course.
intelligence.
Yes, if
That's
this
good,
would
that's
never
good to know,
change.
that's good to know. So, still have a job.
You are saying for now.
I remember at the early days of ChatGPT when I started using it, I was curious to see what would happen if I put in, like, for the title and abstract screening stage, I put in titles of articles related to, extremism and violence. And it actually said, could you find which one seems to be related to the topic? And ChatGPT refused because it said that this was, we touched upon topics like suicide and violence. So just point blank refused, which is interesting. So, yeah.
And another observation is, from time to time, it provides its best guess. But if you ask to support by exact reference.
Oh, no, it hallucinates, it creates. references.
It's like something or say, no, it wasn't exactly this message. It could be attributed to something, but I couldn't find the exact reference or exact quote. So it's too early to delegate the most critical part of the coding or processing the underlying information to this tool. We keep it in mind, but it's too early.
Yeah, so where ChatGPT, oh, no.
Yeah, Adams has his hand.
Yeah, how's, the question was from Adam, so I see you have your hand up as well. Do you have a follow-up?
I would like to. First of all, we can speak more about the methodology, and as Bob said, he very briefly summarized the third supposedly presentation. But we can speak more about our findings of effectiveness of distance online blended learning, and more importantly, show to you, if you are interested in this, not just how research informs practice, but how research guides research by consistently asking the right questions based on what you discovered so far, where to go from there. So that would be, could be a topic of the follow-up.
Okay, there was some interest in a follow-up expressed in the chat as well, so I'll try to know that name and send you an email if we do another workshop. Does anyone have any questions out not in the chat?
Comments.
Comments? Can, if we can, is there audio?
Yeah. People can actually hear us. You can hear them. Can you?
Oh, there is a
Yeah, but
hand raised.
Yeah, but
I don't know.
can you still hear us
Can you
online?
unmute them?
They're not muted, no?
Yeah, we can still hear perfectly. I mean, I don't know if you can hear us, but yeah, I think there's no problem in terms of what's being relayed from your side.
Thanks, David. All right, so I guess if there's no other questions, I know Adam has his hand up, so.
You just unmuted, I think.
Adam?
Yeah, from
But maybe if you just answer their question.
We did.
Yeah, he was the one who asked about artificial
Oh,
intelligence in
okay,
the chat,
sorry.
so perhaps we've already answered his question.
Hello. Hi,
Yes, I'll take
everyone. Yeah. I would like to thank the Center for Learning and Performance, and of course, everyone in Concordia University for organizing this program. And I'm very grateful to Professor Richard Smith because I'm an educational technology, and I've been reading and citing his published works for over 12 years, even right here in Nigeria. So I'm very grateful, sir. It's an honor to meet you tonight. Having said that, I would love the experts in the studio to shed more light on how I can use technological tools and various softwares and artificial intelligence tools to facilitate the process of carrying out systematic reviews and meta-analysis in the field of educational research. Thank you.
So,
I believe Richard's name was.
No, I don't, I know nothing. I mean,
But-
in terms of AI, I think, I think Eugene pretty much covered it. Right now, we are at the point where it might provide additional information. And one of the points I really liked about your research, you finding things that you didn't expect to find. The same holds true with meta-analyses. I mean, we use search terms and so forth, but when we dig into and we start looking at moderator variables, we find some coming up to the surface. And I honestly don't know whether artificial intelligence will sort of pull out these variables that we don't initially expect to find. So we list all these search terms, they come up, of course, because we're looking for them. But you also want to find the important things that you're not necessarily looking for. And so as a heuristic, I think it might provide some support for that, but that's off the top of my.
If you don't limit yourself to artificial intelligence, I can tell you that because, and we didn't speak about it today in anticipation of the upcoming possible event, there are rules for conducting meta-analysis and systematic reviews. One of them is double coding of all information to assure reliability of findings. But it's a hard work to coordinate this kind of coding. So there are tools out there that design specifically for that. For example, I can name to you Covidence.
Yeah.
It allows different people from even different parts of the world access at random abstracts or full text documents, process them, pass their judgment, and the program would compare and identify disagreements, and then online or in person, you can come together and resolve these disagreements to mutual satisfaction. In that case, in that sense, technology is helpful
Yeah.
and it exists,
Yeah, covered it.
but not beyond that. The real decision making is still up to human brain.
Yeah, so having used AI quite a bit, I would say that it's really good where you lay the broad strokes. It's really good for general stuff, not so good for very precise one. So when you're conceptualizing your systematic review, let's say on risk factors for outcome, whatever, and then you're like, have I forgotten any really relevant risk or protective factors? Then you ask ChatGPT, and it's going to be good. Hey, you maybe forgot these two. For keywords, we used it. So we're working on desistance from crime. So can you tell me all of the usual way desistance from crime is pictured? So then and mentioned. So okay, it's desistance, criminal career, the disengagement, blah blah blah. And it's really good at that. I wouldn't yet give to ChatGPT, and we've tried it. ChatGPT is really good at understanding the structure and even doing the methodological quality evaluation if the article is very good. So if the article follows perfectly the frame of introduction, theoretical context, problematic, objectives, methods, sample, blah, 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 then it's good. But as soon as you have a more, let's say, less structured article, then it's going to confuse results with what is related to the introduction, and it's going to go sour real quick. So for precise work, methodological assessment, really like extracting the like precise, okay, so there were these outcomes, these 4 outcomes that were not the same. There were these X predictors, that it's not that good, at least not yet. What it's really good at is thinking about narrative synthesis, and it's freaky how it's, at least as of this morning, it's good. So for
Specifically, yeah.
So for example, one thing that I did is I needed to finish a paper, which is a systematic review that kind of fell into review limbo. So it's now quite outdated. So the editor asked us before submission to just do a quick overview of what has been published since, and if the conclusions are consistent with those of our review that were not formally updating, but kind of narratively updating in discussion. So what I did as of this morning is that once I identified all of the papers with the editor and systematic reviews, recent ones on the topic, I extracted a bunch of papers, let's say around 30, and then selected these. So at the end, five more were eligible. So then I uploaded the 5 PDFs into ChatGPT and said, identify the common ground and not common ground in these papers. So, blah, blah, blah. And then here are the conclusions of our systematic review, and tell us how the conclusions from these 5 or 6 new papers interact with our recommendations. And here's a table of, here's the common ground, here's where it differs, blah, blah, blah. And I can even tell that write me the paragraph that will do exactly that. And of course, and at all of these points,
check it.
And at all of these points, it depends on the prompt you're giving ChatGPT. And of course, you always have to check what it's giving you.
Yeah.
But if you know how to use it, it's frighteningly powerful.
Dave, did you have a question?
The problem is most of us don't know how to use it.
Right.
And that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to echo, I guess, what some other people were saying here. It's just that the process of constructing these meta-analyses, I think this really came out in Eric's presentation, but I mean, I've seen it from the inside myself. It's very fiddly deciding like which studies you're going to include, for example, and the studies are kind of inconsistent. You have to assess the interventions, and there's all these, tricky little steps, which I think are still a little bit beyond what ChatGPT seems to be capable of, as extraordinary as its capabilities often seem to be. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm still pessimistic about its usefulness. And it sounds like, again, Eric has actually tried to put it to the test, and people have kind of found it to be of limited usefulness. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, meta-analysis, it's trickier than you think. Getting your group of studies together and deciding exactly, how you're going to categorize and treat them and include. So yeah, I mean, there is still these elements that require, I think, a lot of skill and dedication on the part of the research team, clearly.
Absolutely. And there is one thing, Eric, that I really was impressed also by your presentation is because what I noticed is that, no, but really what I noticed is that while you presented the results, I mean, it just triggered something in me because I'm very much of a qualitative thinker, so sometimes quantitative is, but when you were presenting each result, in addition to telling us the result, you were questioning what was hidden behind it. And so what it meant, but also what it could not have meant. And then you went and checked, like every time you said, yes, but we could have got this because of that. And so we should go and check what's the style of the teaching or what's been done in the usual practice. So I think that's very interesting because oftentimes we're impressed by the immediate results of a meta-analysis and we stop at that level. Oh, okay, so the meta-analysis is telling us it's a size effect of this much. Oh, this is the greatest program ever, right? And then you're bringing all those nuances. So it kind of reminded me of that trigger that sometimes slips. And I'm not sure that people who consume the results of the meta-analysis, especially people who are not research or savvy, like policymakers or that they need that translation of the results, like this whole knowledge mobilization translation process, which is a completely different art, basically.
I recently heard a very interesting interview that explains why so many decisions are failing. Because supposedly they rely on the opinion of experts. But how it works in real life is that policymaker gathers a few and asked to summarize the main message in 5 minutes. If it's not done in 5 minutes, they stop listening. Or they stop listening people who are saying something who sound out concerns, and they just listen those with whom they already agree. And that's a big problem.
Yeah.
All right, well, I guess if there are any other questions, now's the time to ask, otherwise we'll be wrapping up. Thank you to all the speakers. This was an excellent session. Sorry for running over time. I was responsible for time management, so I failed you there, but
he was carried out by the quality of presentation.
But we have a to be continued now, at least perhaps.
Hopefully so. I would like to also thank the audience for the patience and interest, especially I know that some of you are joining from the different time zone. So thank you very much, guys.
Yes, we have some people from overseas, so thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much.